In the 2011-2012 President's Report of the Northern Territory Cattlemen's Association, the President reported on the $9 million that the Australian federal government had made available to a private company for the purchase of Henbury Station, a pastoral property that was to be destocked of animals and set up as a carbon farming experiment. The President wrote, "This has caused anger and dismay among the local industry. Purchases such as this threaten the long-term future of our industry by removing critical mass and skills from the region. They distort the property market, prevent new entrants to the industry, and they fly in the face of other programs which are intended to encourage on-farm conservation and multiple land use. If government wants to conduct experiments on carbon farming in arid areas, there are plenty of areas outside the pastoral estate to conduct such activities. Why are we adding to the National Reserve System when governments can't even manage what they've already got?" Unquote. Some traditional owners were also opposed to the sale, stating that there was a lack of consultation and that they wished their representative body to purchase the property so they could continue running it as a cattle station. Many scientists also question the feasibility of running a carbon farm in an arid area prone to post-climatic boom fire events. These sorts of tensions in land use related values are common between dryland pastoralists and other non-pastoral populations worldwide. The theme of this workshop is grazing in future multi-scapes, but the path towards pastoral landscapes being recognised as multi-scapes is not likely to be a clear one. Ways in which the good life is understood and the ways in which landscapes and land use in the rangelands contribute to this good life is underpinned by diverse values that vary between interest groups. Synergies and tensions between these diverse groups will have a profound influence on the way in which multi-scapes are realised. Pastoralists, as a dominant land user, are exposed to the bulk of current and future value-based entanglements. Disruptors may rapidly and permanently alter the socio-ecological system, but understanding pastoralist visions and values may help highlight effective and ethical mechanisms by which we can more gently shift current systems towards socially imagined systems. In this presentation, we draw on two case studies from grazed dryland landscapes to highlight the ways in which understanding pastoralist values and visions could help with this shift. We choose case studies from contrasted institutional, cultural, and economic contexts to better explore fit-for-purpose policy options. The first case study is from a typical and desert steppe area of Mongolia, and the second from dryland Australia. Drawing on primary data in the literature, we explore in these contexts what constitutes a meaningful livelihood for pastoralists, how might these imaginings align or misalign with the imaginings of the broader population, particularly those related to environmental management, what inertia against future societal imaginings might a potential misalignment create, and how might policy provide a push or pull against such an inertia. Before I begin in earnest, I'd like to thank and acknowledge colleagues and pastoralists involved in the research around which most of today's presentation is based, as well as other groups who have an interest in currently grazed landscapes, such as the Indigenous Australians who I mentioned today. Okay, if we're asking what constitutes a meaningful livelihood and using such terms as imaginings and social scapes, then we need to make sure we're clear on what we mean. There are a wide range of understandings and frameworks to help us understand what is meant by livelihood, and I won't go into those here. Instead, I'll choose an illustrative example of one framework, the Sustainable Livelihoods Approach. The Sustainable Livelihoods Approach understands a livelihood as the capabilities, assets, and activities required for a means of living. It links a series of capital assets, such as social networks, financial resources, and access to a labour pool, to policies and institutions, and ultimately livelihood strategies. It is these livelihood strategies that produce livelihood outcomes, such as income, but also food security and well-being. A livelihood is considered sustainable when it recovers from stresses and stocks, the vulnerability context shown on the bottom left there, whilst not undermining the natural resource base. Resource users, like pastoralists, have agency. They make choices based upon not only things like capital assets, but also their values. Values of resource users, such as pastoralists, are somewhat but not entirely captured in aspects like cultural processes. However, values are critical for informing not only what a desired livelihood might actually be, but also what sort of livelihood strategies may be considered, chosen, and the conditions under which this may occur in the striving for their livelihood outcome. They also help resource users make meanings of their livelihoods and livelihood strategies overall, as well as the threats to these. They are therefore critical predictors of potential land use tensions in a movement towards multi-use landscapes. In today's presentation, we use the term values to mean the moral principles shaped by institutions, traditions, cultural beliefs, and societal dynamics. And now to the case studies. Despite its relative recentness as a land use, the Australian population continues to attribute cultural meaning to the maintenance of pastoralism. Simultaneously, there is both greater societal scrutiny of the land uses that currently exist and an increasing desire for pastoral areas to become more multi-use. Multi-use in the Australian dryland context tends to refer to an increased emphasis on biodiversity, conservation, outdoor recreation, and Indigenous management of country. As McLean 2009 notes, Australia's drylands should be understood as cultural, contested, and dynamic spaces. Struggles over land use are often not over property rights in a legal sense, but rather moralities linked to relationship to land. In Mongolia, the social, cultural, and economic importance of dryland pastoralism is so strong as to be enshrined in the country's collective identity. The 1992 Constitution states that livestock is the national wealth of the country and subject to state protection. Unlike Australia, the pastoral and urban population in Mongolia is closely linked through family and friend networks, with pastoralists and pastoral culture still visible in urban areas via annual festivals such as Nardam and the significant Gero or yurt districts surrounding the capital of Ulaanbaatar. Nevertheless, tensions are growing between pastoral and non-pastoral actors, particularly with the growth in mining, retreat of the state from the pastoral sector, and advancement of international organisations in the subsequent vacuum, as well as the redistribution of the population that accompanied the transition to the market economy in the 1990s. Non-pastoralists with a stake in pastoral areas of the Australian drylands have deployed different versions of the outback mythology, contemporary frontier ideologies that use landscapes as a loci of identity, meaning and belonging in the general struggle for control of natural resources. The value orientations of dryland Indigenous people, pastoralists and urban conservationists are incredibly differentiated despite a shared interest in dryland natural resources. In relation to an increased societal interest in conservation, these value orientations, with subsequent implications for livelihood strategies, have often alienated pastoralists from the conservation discussion. This alienation has occurred even in the absence of empirical evidence for pastoralism's contribution to declining biodiversity in some contexts. For example, despite the value-driven, widely held belief linking agricultural production and small mammal decline in dryland Australia, reliable evidence establishing grazing as the primary factor for the loss of biodiversity is lacking. Recent decades has also led to an increase in divergence in urban and pastoral value orientations in dryland Australia. Urban understandings of pastoralists sometimes employs a mythology similar to that of the Australian outback. Proximity and understanding of nature, pastoralism is strongly underpinning national identity and culture, and with pastoralists hard-working and sincere. However, urban framings of pastoral life are also inconsistent. Negative representations tend to relate to lack of refinement or sophistication, with rural culture disrespected for the same traditionality as for which it is applauded. As in Australia, negative representations of pastoralists also tend to relate to perceptions around extractive or damaging land management practices, perceptions that have not always been fully reformed by available evidence. Perceived links between pastoralism and declining biodiversity in dryland Australia have resulted in the greater involvement of conservation NGOs. This involvement has likely exacerbated pastoralist alienation. Many pastoralists perceive that areas taken out of agricultural production for conservation purposes are then poorly managed for biodiversity. The subsequent cynicism produced by such a practice may both limit the impact of environmental programs on pastoral land and undermine confidence in participatory strategies for engaging pastoralists with conservation of those areas. Even more so than in Australia, the growing presence of NGOs in Mongolia are both symptomatic of and drivers of contestation. For example, the tangled intersections of pastoral-related values often manifest strongly where international NGO-sponsored community natural resource management groups have been established. The institutions of community natural resource management groups, even when designed in a participatory manner with pastoralists, often weaken with time or are not strongly acknowledged by those for whom they are supposed to benefit. This is perhaps as attempts to strengthen property rights following externally derived understandings of community have created institutional misfits with environmental variability that neglect complex relationships between labour, land and livestock, as summarised by Ndaga's PhD research and book in Mongolia. The livelihood aspirations of dryland pastoralists are complex, encapsulating much more than finances. In Australia, typical northern pastoral enterprises are unprofitable and carry significant debt as measured by earnings after interest before tax. Profits are typically much lower than other agricultural communities in Australia. Pastoralists in areas like the Tanami Desert face social livelihood challenges, including poor access to health and education services and a high reliance on government subsidies and resources. Dryland pastoralists are strongly orientated towards intrinsic, expressive and social values, as opposed to instrumental values where farming is viewed as a means to obtain income and security. They also are strongly orientated towards independence. The pastoral lifestyle that provides them the opportunity to enact these values may partially compensate for such continuing economic and social hardships. Australian dryland pastoralists are very conscious of their custodial role, with often a rich and contextually nuanced understanding of ecological dynamics on their property. However, the high value placed on local knowledge accumulated through time can create tensions with increasing social desire for pastoral drylands to become more multi-use and to be managed in a particular manner to achieve particular cultural and environmental values. Land management decisions and practices embody cultural epistemologies that are diverse, and mismatched perceptions about landscape ecology, biodiversity, and the appropriate tools and policies for dryland management have created tensions between pastoralists and other interest groups. For the dryland pastoral population in Mongolia, good social relations and security are important aspects of a meaningful livelihood. Addison et al. Noted the importance of social cohesion, mutual respect, good family relations, and the ability to help others, such as children, for steppe pastoralists. Secure access to natural and other resources, safety, and living in a predictable and controllable environment are considered equally important. For many Mongolian pastoralists, freedom and choice are also considered parts of livelihoods with the pastoral land use, important parts of livelihoods with the pastoral land use, providing them with both. This freedom and choice is akin to the independence valued by Australian dryland pastoralists. Likewise, this emphasis on freedom and choice does not necessarily conflict with the high value placed on social relations or social values. Pastoralist on pastoralist conflict in relation to access to grazing lands has been frequently cited as being of concern to pastoralists in Mongolia, with pastoralists often expressing a desire for more pastoralist collaboration. However, this desire for increased collaboration is unlikely to extend to the urban population. Similar to the Australian drylands, there is a social boundary between Mongolian pastoralists, the urban population, non-government organisations and the state, They make policy interventions designed to facilitate more multi-use drylands quite difficult. As these two case studies illustrate, pre-existing values and understandings of a meaningful livelihood amongst pastoralists tends to involve independence, security, risk aversion, and longevity as pastoralists rather than wealth or income generation. These values directly inform livelihood strategies that can misalign with broader social values for the drylands. Formal institutions seeking to encourage pastoralists to manage for these broader social values must appreciate the strong emphasis on values other than profit maximisation and be brokered by those who are local and trusted. Various policy mechanisms have been introduced in dryland Australia and Mongolia to increase socially desired values. Carrot and stick policy controls were, and still often are, considered to be important tools for addressing degradation issues, with perceived benefits including fully specified solutions and straightforward monitoring and compliance. In Mongolia and to a lesser extent Australia, a strong involvement by the state was historically accompanied by significant levels of support, such as subsidised mobility and fodder provision in Mongolia's case, and research and development and extension, and the support of things like water development in Australia's case. Whilst Mongolia's grassland condition is believed to have declined since the 1990s, with mixed trends in the Australian drylands, internationally these types of institutional tools have tended to produce limited results, with weaknesses including rigidity, oversimplification, lack of adaptability and inefficiency. In the drylands where climatic variability is high, populations are sparse, and where historically pastoralism was seen to strongly contribute to a sense of national identity, these rule-based constraints have been particularly strong. More recent institutions that devolve responsibility over natural resource management to the level of the individual or local community have also produced mixed results. Community-based natural resource management institutions attempt to promote strong relations between pastoralists, and there is some evidence that social benefits have ensured from these institutions in Mongolia. However, known constraints such as volunteer burnout, perceived inability to translate group activities into demonstrable landscape level environmental outcomes, multi-level tensions within nested governance systems, and a growing conceptualisation of environmental degradation as a form of market failure suggests that community-based natural resource management alone may not be feasible or significant or sufficient. Even Australia's land care movement, reportedly the largest attempt at community-based natural resource management in the world, had little uptake amongst dryland pastoralists turned off by the movement's tree planting image. The model's fundamental need for collective action also risks invoking what Nicholas Gills talks about as being the transgression of property boundaries, not simply in a geographical sense, but also in terms of social and personal space. When choosing whether to become involved in natural resource management programs, primary producers measure the likely net benefits that a program or activities will provide their pre-existing livelihood goals, including material wealth and security, environmental protection, social approval, personal integrity and ethics, and work-lifestyle balance. We'd like to now provide some illustrative examples of types of institutions that may engage pastoralists in the production of more multi-use landscapes by leveraging their pre-existing values and livelihood strategies. In dryland Australia, the development of institutions that respect pastoralist independence and recognise their autonomy over their pastoral lease may facilitate a shift in land use, particularly towards the provision of greater environmental services. The potential involvement of pastoralists in small mammal conservation provides an example. Havey et al. Have found that a large number of threatened small mammals in the drylands can track back to small areas, such as a few hectares, during climatic bust periods, which is most of the time. Many of these areas exist within pastoral leases, rather than within the livestock including conservation estate. The high labour and material costs of nature reserves in dryland Australia, combined with the high level of spatio-temporal variability of natural resources and threats, means pastoralists may be the most cost-effective labour source for the temporally strategic management of small mammal refuges during the so-called climatic early bust phase in wildlife population cycles. Addison and Pavey found that the pastoralist-led culling of the key threats to small mammals, cats and foxes, did not conflict with other pastoralist livelihood aspirations. There was a high willingness and indeed some pre-existing voluntary action for pastoralist management of these predators. There was a high level of interest and concern around small mammal conservation. Reflecting livelihood values being broader than income alone, Addison and Pavey also found that the offer of financial incentives did not increase stated willingness to engage with predator control. However, program design attributes, particularly conservation projects being run by local insiders and being context appropriate at the property level, were important. In theory, the design and implementation of a small mammal conservation program in Australia that was pastoralist-led, contextually appropriate, and run in a manner that respected pastoralist autonomy and independence would deliver greater conservation benefits and fewer social conflicts than the subsumption of a pastoralist into the conservation state. In Mongolia, policies that enhance security in the face of high levels of biophysical variability and promote strong relations between pastoralists may prove attractive, even if they have minimal impact on household wealth. The pilot Payment for Ecosystem Services scheme, described by Upton 2020, provides one example of an institutional intervention that may be more cognizant of pastoralist livelihood values. The scheme seeks to link international purchases of carbon credits with community-based sellers of carbon. In Mongolia's case, a community-based natural resource management group committed to changing herd management in ways that increase stored carbon. To reframe Upton 2020, a carbon-based payment for ecosystem services institution may exploit an alignment between pastoralist livelihood aspirations unrelated to carbon and the carbon-related values of the international community. By being community-based and bottom-up, rather than targeted at the level of the individual, it may also strengthen pastoralist relations while still providing the informational and financial support needed to initiate and maintain the changes in herd management then needed to improve environmental services. As Upton noted, non-monetary incentives such as participation in governance were considered at least as important to many pastoralists involved in the pilot as the potential payments themselves. To summarise, in drylands under a pastoral land use, geographical factors like high levels of climatic variability and sparse populations, combined with social factors like high levels of independence, mean that pastoralists' understanding of the good life can relate more to livelihood security and autonomy than immediate material wealth. These values can misalign with the imaginings of the non-pastoral population for drylands that are managed for a broader set of values, or seek to be so, such as conservation, or in the urban case in Mongolia, meat safety. Engagement with institutions designed to fulfil broader social values are dependent upon the ability of these institutions to help pastoralists also meet their value-driven livelihood goals. While there may be striking commonalities in values between pastoralist groups, context-specific understandings of pastoral values and visions can highlight appropriate policy options that may shift socio-ecological systems towards those that are more broadly socially desirable, with less social conflict. But the design of these options requires an understanding of unique combinations of pastoral and societal values, biophysical parameters and institutional contexts. And just so you know how the story ends, R.M. Williams, the owners of Hembury Station, who sought to establish a carbon farm, went into receivership in 2013 and the pastoral property was put back on the market. Hembury Station was sold as a cattle property to a group that were not Indigenous traditional owners, with a large percentage of the sale price being returned to the Australian government, reflecting their investment in the property as a carbon farm. About 20% of the property is now protected under a special conservation.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much for pre-recording it and sending it all through. It obviously all worked. I have a very naive question. This isn't really my area at all. I'm really quite new to this. I've only been at Lincoln for about 5 weeks now. So I've been doing biomedical research for about the last 20 years. So it's slightly different.
Bit of a change, yeah.
Although I did train here. So it's like coming home really. So it's really interesting because we have the same sort of thing going on in New Zealand, particularly around dairy farming and other bits and pieces, and the perception where, dirty dairy and the ecosystem is not being looked after, the environment is not being looked after. And a lot of farmers are doing a lot of work to try and, to be good farmers and to not wreck their land. It's not in their best interest to do it. But the popular press, if you like, really only picks up the bad eggs and the headlines, if you just want to read them when they come in, basically sort of tend to have the urban population sort of butting heads against the farming population. And as more urban people get a supermarket mentality around where their food comes from, so they become more and more divorced from it, those sorts of negative headlines and things that you tend to get tend to sort of stick. So the perception is that farming is bad, and it ignores all the good work that farmers are doing to maintain their environments. How do you get cut through on that? It's just very, very difficult, because you can see that once that sort of news item sort of sticks, that's what people's perception is. And it's really, really hard for farmers to say, well, hey, hold on, I've got all of this mitigation in place, and what's happening. So do you have any ideas?
I think that's a really tricky question, really. And I think something that, it's a story that goes around the world, really. I think it's so common. There's so many, particularly in pastoral contexts, there's so much transition happening at the moment, so much land use change. And whenever that happens, there's going to be that butt of sort of values and conflicts there. I think I talked about the Australian dryland space, and certainly the press actually around that conservation pastoral interaction isn't all that interested in that. But I think it's actually I guess conservation interests that are feeding some of that conflict as opposed to the press. So I think some stepping back and trying to approach things in a different way from a more collaborative or partnering, a gentler approach rather than coming out guns blazing is always a good way to try and work together. It's all those principles of I guess coming out with a less aggressive attitude, I think is the way to go. But in terms of the example that you talked about with the media involved, I think it's all very, very tricky. I think I'm sure HR or I'm sure PR people would have something to say about how you try and bridge some of those gaps as well. But perhaps some leadership in the space. I mean, I framed the talk around, I guess, the theme of this particular conference, which is the assumption that we're going towards something. And, my fundamental message is, if that's what we want to do, we do actually need to bring on board everyone and move towards it together in a more collaborative style. So perhaps some leadership on that would be great. Yeah.
So when you talk about the loss of biodiversity and things like that, how bad is that sort of getting? And is that a result of dryland farming, or is it just a result of natural attrition?
In the Australian context? It depends who you talk to. But the empirical evidence suggests it's more predation from introduced cats and foxes than farming. The pastoralism. The direct empirical evidence linking livestock and decline in mammal population in Australia is relatively weak. Yeah.
Yeah. So is that rise in pest species outside of livestock animals and things, so your wild cats, etc. Have their numbers got out of control because of urban populations not liking the control measures put in place?
Yes and no. I mean, these areas are a really long way from urban populations, you know, sometimes hundreds, thousands of kilometres away. So it's a historical problem. They're now self-sustaining populations across the whole country, really. So it probably wouldn't matter what the urban population now did. Those threats would still be there. Those species would still be there. But there is also that urban tension, I guess, around things like cat populations and dealing with domestic species that go wild. But I'm not sure that dealing with that would actually change the problem. Yeah, right. At the moment. Yeah. In the dryland pastoral areas. Yeah.
Right, because we tend to have a lot of wild cats are an issue here.
Yeah. Yes.
Most of our bird species, a lot of them are flightless and on the ground.
Yes, yeah.
And they've decimated a lot of areas for us here.
Yeah.
But cats, because they're domestic cats and people have cats, they get an awe factor from the public, particularly in cities, who don't have to see the problem firsthand. And basically to try and control them is actually really, really hard, because they sort of go, oh no, you can't kill the cats, you know. And it's the same maybe with possum control and other bits and pieces here as well. I think there's a lack of it's probably one of the one places where the farming community and conservationists probably agree, and you get that synergy that's going on, because the possums are an ecological nightmare here. And so the conservation.
Sorry about that. We gave them to you.
Well, yes. I remember when I was a kid, they were just starting to become a real hassle, and then the anti-fur people weren't allowing you to make money from trapping and killing them, so they got really out of hand. And they decided that they might like to farm them and sell them to the Japanese market as apple-eating tree bears.
That's great.
I'm not able to raise my hand, but I have a question. I'm interested in this role of NGOs, and particularly it seems like there's a lot of sort of creation of new, I would say almost economic opportunities from them, from conservation. And I guess I'm wondering, like, for example, with payments for ecosystem services, is it possible to have payments for ecosystem services without having to create a whole opportunity for these income for these NGOs too? I mean, it just seems like there's this, I don't know, I'm from the United States and California, and it seems like we have I would say a new tension where there's a need now to sustain the livelihood of the NGOs. So I guess my question is, what is this role for them, and is it sustainable?
Thanks, Robin. Are you referring to larger NGOs or more grassroots, locally sort of developed NGOs that then need to find a funding model?
I would say it could be all, but yeah, I mean, particularly in my area, it'd be the local ones.
Yeah,
smaller ones, but it's the Nature Conservancy too, you know.
Yeah.
And I think there's definitely that's a piece, I know, worldwide in development, but even in you know, in sort of the developed world, yes, they also are. Yeah, I've just been sort of trying to understand what is this role, and how is it a necessary role?
Is the NGO role necessary? I guess, yeah, there's a few things in there, isn't there? Yeah, I think at least, you know, in the Australian context, our local grassroots initiatives, they seem to fall over because of things like, yeah, volunteer saturation and just burnout. And I suspect that's the case in a lot of places. So the argument there is that they do need a funding model, which perhaps then pushes them down towards that payment for ecosystem services path, you know, which may or may not be the best path, but I guess they have to try and find funding somewhere. I think the role of NGOs in general is a interesting question. I know there's been some work done, not in the pastoral space in Australia, but some research in general questioning the role of environmental NGOs, full stop, and the power that they have and the influence that they have. And given that they're neither sort of democratically elected, I guess, like a government is. So what's the accountability there? What's the transparency there? Given that level of influence and increasing influence as well. So yeah, I think there's a range of questions there. But if you do, I guess, as a government, choose to step back from, in this case, the pastoral sector, then there's a vacuum there, isn't there, really? And someone's going to fill it. You know, and increasingly in a neoliberal, moving down that model, then the groups that step in, it will be more towards markets and market-based approaches, I guess. Yeah, I think there's a big question there that we haven't fully teased out yet around the role of NGOs. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Robin?
That was Sheila that asked the question.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Sheila. Yeah.
Has anybody else got any further questions? Or, yep, Robin.
Yeah, so Jane, thank you very much for that presentation. And I'm not going to ask you a question about your presentation, but I did enjoy it and learn something from it. But it maybe slightly more broadly on previous work that you've done and just your thoughts. So I'm not sure that I'm on the solidest of ground of making this summary I'm going to make, but my impression from reading the literature and your work and our work in Mongolia and other work elsewhere is that it seems like these community-based organizations that tackle improving rangeland management in dry pastoral systems, they seem to reach their social goals more easily than their ecological goals. And I wonder, it looks like there's a bit of a disconnect there, and we've been noodling on why that may be so. It certainly showed very strongly in our work in Mongolia. Do you have any thoughts for, you know, where that disconnect is and why it's happening and that sort of thing? We'd love to have some help thinking that through with you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the work that Maria, the project there that I guess worked across ecological zones was really fantastic, I think, in highlighting some of those reasons. And it just seems to be coming back to that non-equilibrial gradient, I guess, which makes some sense. So I think that model may well be far more effective ecologically in those more northern areas in Mongolia. Perhaps the south is just a bit trickier. I think, you know, there's always going to, well, not always, but just the risks of there being an institutional misfit, I guess, between social and ecological spatial boundaries in the south is always going to be much greater, I guess, just because of that higher climatic variability. And that mismatch, I suggest, would predict that it'd be more difficult to achieve those ecological outcomes. May also be that those areas aren't especially overgrazed to begin with. So you're not going to see that change associated with that particular institutional model as well. So I guess but that's also linked perhaps back to that higher variability explanation as well. So I guess, you know, it'd be good to tease that out more, but that would be my initial thoughts. But it was fantastic to see that work done across that climatic gradient to really help understand that, or to help, yeah, nut that out a little bit. Yeah.
Thank you.
I can ask a question also. You kind of alluded to the how in Mongolia there's this strong collective identity related to pastoralism and rural life, and the importance of social relations in Mongolia. And I'm wondering if you have observed that changing at all, and if so, what you think the consequences might be if you know, pastoralists and well, I guess it's a two-part question. Maybe pastoralists themselves start to maybe not take such pride in that identity, and that the Mongolian sort of national or cultural identity, if you will, becomes less and less associated with that nomadic heritage and its current iteration. And, you know, what might that mean for the sustainability of that system?
It's a huge question, Maria. Yeah, and I guess one that different people have posited at different times. I don't know. I guess the first question is around whether I think that sense of identity has changed. And actually, I find that quite tricky, because although I think there is a really strong sense of identity, I think there's also quite a high level of pragmatism amongst herders around what they want for their children, for example. And, you know, quite a few actually, you know, don't want, or I guess are fearful for their children continuing as pastoralists. So I think there's, on one hand, there's strong collective identity. On another, there's a bit of pragmatism around where that might go in the future. Yeah, I'm not sure what that might look like in future, or what it should look like. You know, the economists might say that structural adjustment is the way things need to go. Yeah, I don't think I can really answer that with anything useful to say, or yeah, well thought through to say.
Well, I think you're right on in terms of the pragmatism, and I think it's not only in Mongolia. I think it's in many places, especially where you have a you know, quote unquote traditional pastoral societies, especially mobile pastoral groups. Do you see any pathway for I guess development, and for, you know, the things that, in my experience anyway, the Mongolian pastoralists are worried about for their children are the, you know, lack of access to good education, to good services, you know, and there's been an underinvestment in rural services in Mongolia since the transition. Do you see any realistic pathway towards, you know, and allowing pastoralists to continue to manage in a, you know, in a mobile and sustainable way, but overcoming that lack of rural investment and services to, you know, that would enable them to have a, you know, a comparable, I don't want to say lifestyle, but, you know, access to the things that they want in terms of livelihoods, I guess, and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I think on one hand, it's tempting and really easy to say that there are comparable dryland pastoral contexts where those services are provided, and you know, it's tempting for me to now talk about arid Australia, where, for example, we have a strong school of the air system where students, you know, where they can access education remotely and not go to boarding school till they're older. So there are, you could argue, telehealth. There are models, but even in a very wealthy context like Australia, we don't have, you know, there are still poorer health and education outcomes for those populations. So they're moving more towards supportive services in that area, I think is definitely a way that could help continue, I guess, particularly that mobility side of things, which is so crucial really at the moment, and probably should be forever. Yeah, so I think there's models from elsewhere, but I think yeah, there's also no easy panacea in all of this, and it's not simply about strengthening other social services as well. I think there might possibly always be a gap if that's what people want to continue in as a livelihood. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I agree with you. I do think also that some of the issue is more society valuing more broadly the ecosystem services and or benefits to humanity, shall we say, benefits and to the planet of certain ways of living and producing and stewarding those lands and compensating in some way or those stewards. And there's, you know, the traditional payment for ecosystem services has so many moral hazards involved in that it rewards people who've been doing a bad job for improving, and it doesn't reward people who've been doing a good job for continuing to do it. And also, if you know, just from a scientific standpoint, the potential for carbon sequestration is not tremendous.
That's right. Yeah.
So it's other services that we need to be looking at, I think, or a broader suite of both tangible and intangible benefits to society.
Yeah, and so in the recent project that a group of us have been involved in Mongolia, one of our environmental economists did a choice modelling survey with the urban population in Ulaanbaatar to try and understand how much they would be willing to basically pay for the cultural and environmental services that come from pastoral areas. And, you know, they had a set of different things that they were willing to pay for, and it's perhaps unsurprisingly meat safety was quite high. So whereas the international community wouldn't necessarily be, that wouldn't be a strong thing, but the willingness to pay, and there's a whole range of weaknesses with that particular method, but it was actually quite low. So at least within Mongolia, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, I guess, willingness to convert that value into dollar terms at the moment. But I obviously agree with the international community and carbon. I mean, drylands are really not the best landscape for that to happen. So until another, I guess, way of valuing evolves, and I think it's getting there. You know, the fire-based or the carbon-based payment for ecosystem services in Northern Australia now are around changed fire regimes to try and benefit carbon that are happening across the Indigenous estate in the north. There's more and more movement towards incorporating cultural services into that payment as well. So perhaps with time, those markets will develop and Mongolia might be able to be captured in there somehow. But yeah.
And I wonder if and I'll stop talking because I'm dominating the question.
No, this is great.
I wonder if, you know, when you said about Mongolia and the food safety, I'd be very, you know, I'll look for that paper. I don't know.
Yeah, I can send it to you. Yeah.
But I do think that a food systems approach more broadly is one way to sort of link together some of these things. And you know, in more of the developed world context, we're seeing consumers willing to pay more for their meat in particular, but also other products that are produced in a certain way. And if somehow that meat safety was also linked with other attributes, that would be.
But I guess the lack of international export, the lack of an export market really in Mongolia then starts constraining that. So there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing around, I guess, the food safety before you can get to that to then get the payment. But yeah.
But even if it's the domestic population,
yeah.
safer meat,
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
that could be extended to other products. But anyway,
Yeah,
thank
for
you so
sure.
much.
No worries. Thanks, Maria.
Yeah, I've got a question. I was just wondering, what do you think the future holds? What are the risks on here, like climate change and things like that? Like, what's the next big problem going to be in this space, you reckon?
Oh, that's a little bit like Maria's question. That's a big question, Cameron. And I don't think I could answer that, to be honest. I mean, climate change is a huge risk, but it's not clear how it's going to land and what ability there is for dryland pastoral systems to respond to what opportunities there are. I feel like it's too much of a dynamic space to be able to unpack all of that yet. Yeah, I don't know, Cameron, I'm sorry. Not something I've thought through very well, perhaps.
No, that's all right. I'm just always curious to hear other people's opinion.
Yeah. Do you have thoughts?
It's just going to be a big problem, and it's going to, yeah, change other things, present some opportunities, potentially. Yeah, I don't know. It's just, I know here in South Island of New Zealand, we're expecting half of the South Island to get a lot wetter and the other half to get a lot drier. And I'm not quite sure what the modelling is for Mongolia or Australia. So yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I feel like the local manifestation of climate change will be everything, but within context of what's happening at national and international scales. So it's really hard to talk about it at, I guess, a local level, what that might look like and the changes that might happen. And yeah, so much, I guess, reverberation is going to happen through the system. Yeah, it's a tricky one to try and get your head around, I think. Yeah.
Great. I've got one other very quick question, just in current context. You said just before when talking with Maria that, you know, there's a lack of services, obviously, you know, because you've got vast amounts of spaces, which I probably can't even comprehend. Do you think that, given COVID-19 and all the lockdowns and the isolation that urban people are now feeling, that they may actually have some more empathy towards pastoralists that are in isolated communities and maybe want to help them do stuff about it?
No, I'm not sure people will think about things in that way. I've asked myself the same question in relation to other things, such as, you know, Australia's treatment of asylum seekers on remote islands off the coast, and wondered whether that will increase our empathy. But I'm not sure that it will, to be honest. But I have no, you know, I haven't done research into that, so I don't know. But if I had to guess, I'd probably say no.
Can I go back to Cameron's question? Because one of the things that, at least I work a lot in Africa, and then also harking back to the presentation by the Sami herder last week in this conference. It seems what I'm hearing pastoralists say in those contexts, and what I heard her say, was climate change is a thing that's here and it's slowly happening, but the really big thing is extraction. And so Mongolia, you know, potentially mining in certain areas, but it may be restricted in extent, but not with ninja miners. They're all over the place, right? But, you know, in Africa, wow, you know, talking about all kinds of developments, especially driven by Chinese investment. And then the Sami herder was talking about renewable energy. So I think there's kind of this green economy shift, I would guess.
Yeah.
I would keep a really close look on that.
Yeah.
What that means for these vast, open, empty areas that everyone says, oh, there's nobody there. Let's just put up all the windmills and, you know, and all the pads and all that sort of thing that you need to drive between them. Anyway, it's just sort of something to think about.
Yeah, and Robin, I'd add to that, not in a pastoral context, but the little amount of research that's been done in remote Indigenous communities in Australia around climate change has suggested that disadvantage is so huge, and the number of issues that those communities feel like they're dealing with. Climate change is almost not irrelevant, but it's almost something that I want deal with, because it's one more thing that gets added into that really, really difficult mixture of I don't want to use the word vulnerability, but you know, there's a lot going on for them, and yeah, climate change is just one more thing. So from their point of view, yeah, it's not the thing. Yeah, and I think that's something to be very much mindful of, and particularly around, at least in the Australian Indigenous context, you know, as researchers, being really careful about how we talk to people about it, because if you're just adding in one more threat, I guess, to what is already a tricky context, without actually offering some support around it, then you know, it's not necessarily fair. Yeah. That's in a non-pastoral context in Australia. Yeah.